The letter arrived on the same morning Cole Danner brought in the Perez brothers, both hog-tied across their saddles, their bounty already spent 3 times over in his mind before he ever reached the sheriff's office. He hadn't opened the envelope right away. Men in his line of work learned early that paper brought worse news than lead, and Cole Danner had survived 22 years of chasing dangerous men across the American Southwest by trusting his instincts above all else. But somewhere between the sheriff's office in Redemption Creek and the 3rd glass of rye at the Lucky Star Saloon, he unfolded the crinkled envelope and read the words that would unravel everything he thought he knew about the man who had raised him from the time he was 7 years old. His uncle Silas Danner was dead, and he had left Cole a cabin, not money, not a deed to grazing land, not a bankroll, not even a decent horse. A cabin, tucked into the high ridges of the Sierra Madre Range, in a place called Coldwater Pass, where the snow stayed on the ground until late May, and the pines grew so thick a man could disappear for a lifetime if he had a mind to do it. Cole had never heard of the place. He had never heard Silas mention Coldwater Pass. Not once in all the years the old man had kept him, fed him, taught him to shoot and track and read the signs that other men missed. And that silence, that deliberate, careful absence, was what made Cole fold the letter back into his breast pocket and order a 4th glass of rye with something cold settling deep in his chest. Silas Danner had been a hard man, but a fair one. He stood 6 feet tall in his prime, broad across the shoulders with the kind of hands that told the full history of a life lived by labor. Calloused palms, knuckles thick as river stones, the right index finger slightly bent from an old break that never set properly. His hair had gone white before he turned 50, and his eyes were a pale, washed-out gray that people who didn't know him sometimes mistook for kindness. Those who did know him understood it was simply clarity. Silas Danner saw things exactly as they were, without the softening that sentiment applied to ordinary men's vision. He had never married. He had never, to Cole's knowledge, owned property beyond the small rented room in Laredo, where he lived in the later years, with a single window facing the alley and a cot that barely accommodated his frame. So the existence of a cabin in the mountains of New Mexico Territory no less, was not merely surprising, it was a mystery, and Cole Danner, whatever else he was, had never in his life been able to leave a mystery alone. Cole himself was 34 years old, lean and weathered in the way that men become when they spend most of their days outdoors under a hard sun. He stood just under 6 feet, with dark brown hair worn slightly long beneath a wide-brimmed black hat that had seen better decades. His jaw carried several days of dark stubble, and his eyes, a deep, steady brown, moved constantly, cataloguing exits, threats, the angle of light through a window. He wore a long canvas duster, dark with trail dust, over a dark shirt and worn trousers tucked into boots that had crossed half the territories west of the Mississippi. His gun belt sat low on his right hip, carrying a Colt Single Action Army revolver with worn walnut grips that his hand knew by feel better than it knew anything else in the world. He was not a man who drew attention to himself in a crowd, but he was precisely the kind of man that other dangerous men noticed immediately. Something in the way he occupied space, calm and watchful, like a hawk sitting motionless on a fence post. He had been a bounty hunter for 11 years. Before that, 2 years as a deputy in a town called Harrows Bend, Arizona Territory, which ended badly when he discovered the sheriff he worked for was taking bribes from the Cassidy cattle operation. Before that, a brief and chaotic stretch as a scout for the army, which ended when he declined to follow an order he considered morally indefensible. He had never worked long for anyone but himself. He had never owned land, never staked a claim, never put his name on a deed. The idea of having a place that was his, that stayed in one spot while he moved through the world, had simply never attached itself to his imagination. Until now. If this story is keeping you company out on the trail, we'd be much obliged if you'd subscribe to the channel. It takes nothing but a moment and it means everything to us. Now back to Cole Danner and the mountain. He left Redemption Creek the following morning with his horse Dusty, a tall grey gelding of no particular breeding but extraordinary endurance, loaded with enough supplies for a week's hard riding. The lawyer's letter had included a rough map, hand-drawn in ink that had faded to the color of weak tea, with Coldwater Pass marked by a small cross and the notation Dana Cabin in cramped, careful handwriting Cole did not recognize as his uncle's. Silas had never been much for writing things down. He used to say that men who wrote things down trusted paper more than memory, and paper could be found. The ride north took 4 days through country that grew progressively wilder and less forgiving. Cole crossed the flat basin country where the scrub brush grew low and the sky was enormous and pale with heat, then climbed into the foothills where the soil turned red and the rocks came up through it like the knuckles of a buried giant. By the third day he had entered the pine country, where the shadows fell cool and long across the trail, and the air carried the clean sharpness of elevation. He passed through a small settlement called Arroyo Seco. 40 or 50 souls clustered around a general store, a livery, and a saloon with a broken front window that no one had bothered to repair. He stopped only long enough to water Dusty and buy a sack of dried beans and some hardtack, but even in those 20 minutes, he registered the particular quality of silence that ran through the place, the way conversation stopped when he dismounted, the way eyes tracked him from doorways without making direct contact, the way the man behind the counter at the general store answered every question with the minimum number of words required and watched Cole's hands the entire time. There was fear in Arroyo Seco, long-standing, carefully maintained fear, worn smooth by habit. Cole had seen it before, in towns that labored under the particular tyranny of one powerful man or one violent organization. He filed it away and said nothing. On the fourth morning he rode up into the mountains proper, where the pines closed in and the trail narrowed to a single track barely wide enough for horse and rider. The air turned cold and sharp, carrying the smell of pine resin and old snow from the high places. The map proved surprisingly accurate. There was a fork at a distinctive split boulder, a creek crossing at a place where 2 large pines had fallen together to form a natural arch, and then a gradual climb along a ridgeline until the trail bent left around a granite outcrop and the cabin appeared. Cole stopped Dusty on the trail and looked at it for a long moment. It was smaller than he'd imagined, built from rough-hewn pine logs that had weathered to silver gray, with a low-pitched roof that sagged slightly on the east side and a stone chimney that needed repointing. A covered porch ran across the front, its floor planks warped and dark with moisture from mountain winters. 2 windows faced the trail, their shutters closed, a woodpile to one side, half collapsed, a small corral to the other side, empty, the post still solid, but the rails missing in 2 places. It had the look of a place that had been deliberately kept up for years, then deliberately abandoned. Not neglected, abandoned. There was a difference. Neglected places fell apart slowly through inattention. Abandoned places were walked away from on purpose, left behind like something a man couldn't carry, but couldn't bring himself to destroy either. Cole dismounted, tied Dusty to the porch rail, and stood listening for a full minute before he stepped up onto the porch. Force of habit. The boards groaned under his weight but held. He tried the door, unlocked, which he noted, and pushed it open into the dim interior. The inside was one main room with a stone fireplace dominating the far wall, a low sleeping loft accessible by a ladder, and a small back room barely large enough for a cot, which turned out to contain a dry sink and a shelf of tools. The main room held a table, 2 chairs, a narrow cot, and a set of shelves that still held food. Tins of peaches and sardines, a sack of cornmeal, a jar of ground coffee. Someone had stocked it recently. The dust on the floor was thin, weeks of accumulation, not years. On the table, positioned at its center as though placed there deliberately, was a single item, a journal, dark brown leather, worn at the corners. And on the inside front cover, in cramped handwriting that matched the notation on the lawyer's map, a single line written in heavy ink, "You'll understand when you go below." Cole read it 3 times. Then he set the journal on the table and made coffee. He spent the rest of that day going over the cabin in the methodical way he went over everything, room by room, surface by surface, looking for what didn't belong and listening for what the place was trying to tell him. He found nothing immediately remarkable in the main room or the back room. The loft held a rolled-up bedroll, a spare set of work clothes in Silas's size, and a pair of boots so old the leather had cracked beyond repair. Everything was clean, orderly, intentional. He read the journal that evening by firelight, the pine logs crackling and the mountain wind moving around the corners of the cabin with a sound like low breathing. Silas had kept the journal for 3 years. The entries irregular, sometimes daily, sometimes weeks between them. The early entries were mundane: weather observations, maintenance notes, records of supplies purchased in Arroyo Seco. But around the midpoint of the journal, the tone shifted like a change in weather. The Hargrove men were in the valley again today. 3 of them, riding the north fence line like they own it, which they will soon enough if things go the way they're pushing. Spoke to Ruiz at the general store. He won't say what they told him, but I can read a frightened man. They've been working on everybody in the valley, one at a time, quiet and steady. That's Doyle Hargrove's way. Patient, thorough, mean like a slow frost that kills the roots before you see any damage on the surface. Cole read that passage twice. He knew the name Hargrove vaguely. It had surfaced in conversations over the years, attached to the kind of casual reputation that powerful men in the territories acquired when they operated just carefully enough to avoid formal charges. Landmen, people called them. Men who understood that the real wealth in the American West wasn't in cattle or in gold, but in the land itself, and that in places far from established law, land could be acquired by methods that had no polite names. "There's a reason I came here," Silas had written in a later entry. "Not the quiet, though I don't mind the quiet. Not the mountains, though they suit me well enough. I came because of what's below the cabin. What's been below it since before I built the walls. What I found by accident the first winter and have spent 3 years deciding what to do about. I keep coming back to the same answer: nothing. Not while I'm alive, but I can't let it disappear entirely. Cole would know what to do. Cole always knew what to do when things got complicated, even when he was 10 years old, and I thought I was the one doing the teaching. Below." The word appeared twice now. Cole set the journal down and looked at the floor. He spent the better part of an hour examining it. Pine planks, rough-fitted, the gaps stuffed with dried moss and clay. He tested each plank with his boot heel, listening and feeling for variation. Near the fireplace, in the corner where the light fell worst, one plank gave back a different sound. Hollow, not the dense thud of packed soil beneath, but a lighter resonance, an empty space answering back. Cole moved the small rug that covered the area, crouched down, ran his fingers along the plank edges until he found the recessed iron ring, dark and small, nearly invisible against the dark wood. He pulled. A trapdoor lifted on leather hinges, revealing a narrow stair descending into darkness. A smell came up: cold earth, old timber, and something mineral and clean that Cole couldn't immediately name. He went back to the table for the lantern. The space below the cabin was larger than he had imagined possible. Silas had excavated and reinforced a natural depression in the granite, bracing the walls with heavy timber, laying a rough plank floor over the packed earth, running it back into the mountain itself for 20 feet, before the granite closed it off entirely. The ceiling was barely high enough to stand in without ducking. Along the walls, on rough-built shelves, were stacked wooden crates, perhaps 30 of them of varying sizes, sealed with wax and marked in Silas's handwriting. Cole opened the nearest one. Inside, packed carefully in straw, were gold ingots. He stood there in the lantern light for a considerable time without moving. The crate held 8 ingots, each the size of a small brick, bearing no stamp, no marking of any kind. Raw, unprocessed gold, dull and heavy and undeniable. He opened 2 more crates. Both held the same. He did not open all 30 crates. He did not need to. He was looking at a fortune. A genuine, staggering, life-altering fortune in raw gold bullion, stored in a hole under a forgotten mountain cabin by an old man who had never, in Cole's living memory, owned anything that couldn't fit in a saddlebag. He went back upstairs, poured himself a measure of whiskey from the bottle in his saddlebag, and sat down at the table with the journal. He read the rest of it in one long sitting, the fire burning lower and the wind picking up outside. The full story took several hours to absorb. Silas had written it in pieces, as though he kept returning to add details he'd initially omitted or correct impressions he felt he'd left incomplete. The core of it was this. 22 years ago, Silas Danner had been part of a small group of 4 men who discovered a lost placer deposit in the high country above what was now Coldwater Pass. Not a formal mine, not a registered claim, a natural accumulation in a mountain stream, exposed when a section of hillside gave way in a spring flood. The 4 men worked it in secret for 18 months, trusting no one, filing no claims, moving the extracted gold out in small quantities over the course of regular supply runs. By the time the deposit played out, they had taken what Silas estimated to be the better part of $250,000 in raw gold out of that mountain. Then the trouble came, as it always did when men put that much gold between themselves and their better natures. One of the 4, a rancher named Preston Webb, decided that a quarter share was insufficient. He approached the other 2 partners while Silas was away on a 3-day supply run to the nearest town. Cole would never know exactly what words passed between them, or what ultimately transpired, but when Silas returned, Webb was waiting for him alone with the news that the other 2 partners, men named Calloway and Birch, had suffered a fatal accident up on the ridgeline. 2 men, 1 accident. Silas had looked at Preston Webb's face and understood immediately what had happened. He also understood with perfect clarity that he was the next item on Webb's accounting. What saved him was simple chance. A passing trapper who appeared on the trail at the precise moment that provided a witness to their confrontation. Webb backed down. In the tense standoff that followed over the next several days, they reached a division. Webb took 2/3 of the accumulated gold and rode out of the territory. Silas took the remaining third, disappeared into the mountains, and built his cabin over the cache. He never saw Preston Webb again. But Webb had a son. Doyle Hargrove is Preston Webb's boy, the journal read near the end. Changed his name when Preston died, took his mother's family name, which was smart enough, since Preston Webb was wanted in 3 territories by the time he drank himself to death in Tucson in 1871. But Doyle knows what his father knew. He's been aware for years that his father's share wasn't the whole of what came out of that mountain. He's been working toward it patiently, buying land in the valley, pushing out the smaller settlers, building his position until he controls every approach to this mountain. He hasn't come for the cabin yet because he hasn't been entirely certain I know where the rest is, but he's getting close to certain. I've seen his men on the trail twice this year. I'm writing this because I'm 68 years old, and my heart has been telling me things I don't care to hear. I can't move the gold out myself. I'm too old for the kind of fight that would come with it, and I have no one left to trust. But Cole trusts no one easily, which is better than trusting the wrong man. Cole can find a way through. Son, the final entry read, the handwriting slightly less steady than the rest. Written near the end of things, I know I never said it properly. I know I should have said it 20 years ago instead of now. At the bottom of a page you'll read after I'm gone. But there it is. I was proud of every year of your life that I watched. Do what you think is right with what's below, and watch yourself with Hargrove. He is his father's son down to the marrow. Cole sat at the table for a long time after he finished. The fire burned down to coals, and the mountain wind pulling steadily at the shuttered windows. Then he closed the journal, checked his revolver, and went to sleep. Morning came cold and sharp, with a hard frost silvering the porch planks and the smell of high snow somewhere above the tree line. Cole made coffee, ate hardtack with a tin of sardines, and sat on the porch steps watching the trail below with the patient stillness of a man accustomed to waiting for things to reveal themselves. He had several assets. He had the gold, considerable leverage if he could move it, considerable danger while it stayed where it was. He had the journal, which documented the history in Silas's own handwriting. He had the cabin, and whatever legal standing the inheritance granted him. And he had his own skills, his reputation, and the particular brand of patience that developed in men who spent years tracking dangerous people across unforgiving country. He had several problems. He was alone in unfamiliar territory. He didn't know the extent of Doyle Hargrove's operation or the number of men he could call on. He didn't know whether his arrival at the cabin was already noted, and given that Hargrove apparently kept watchers on the approach trails, he had to assume it was. He didn't know who in the valley, if anyone, could be trusted. He thought about Arroyo Seco, the silence there, the frightened storekeeper, the quality of a town that had been leaned on for years. That was a resource, potentially, not the fear itself, but the resentment that fear always carried underneath it, kept alive like an ember in ash. People who had been pushed long enough by the same hand were capable of remarkable things when someone came along who wasn't afraid of that hand. But first, he needed to understand what he was up against. That meant going into the valley. He saddled Dusty, left the cabin as unremarkable as he could make it, and rode down the mountain. Arroyo Seco looked different in the clear morning light, smaller somehow, more obviously pressed upon by the surrounding land. Cole counted the buildings as he rode in: the general store, the saloon, a blacksmith shop, a small church with whitewashed walls going grey with age, 4 or 5 houses set back behind the main strip. And at the far end of the single street, a building that bore a painted sign in new, bright letters that looked entirely out of place against the weathered wood of everything around it. Hargrove Land Company. He tied Dusty at the hitching post outside the saloon, called the Mountain Rest, according to the hand-lettered board above the door, and went inside. It was early enough that the place held only a few souls. A single man at the bar nursing something amber, 2 old-timers at a corner table engaged in a card game they seemed to be playing more from habit than interest. The barkeep was a heavy-set man in his 50s with a thick grey moustache and the watchful, careful eyes of someone who had spent years learning to observe without appearing to observe. Cole ordered coffee. When it came, he said, without raising his voice, "What can you tell me about Doyle Hargrove?" The barkeep looked at him the same way the storekeeper had looked at him the day before. Hands, face, the gun on his hip. A long assessment. "He's a businessman," the barkeep said, which was not particularly informative. "Reckon he is. What kind of business?" "Land. He buy land willing, or does he find other methods?" The barkeep picked up a glass and began polishing it with a cloth that had seen better years. "Mister," he said, "I don't know you, and in this town, not knowing a man is its own kind of answer." Cole accepted that with a nod. He drank his coffee and listened to the ambient silence of the saloon, and after a few minutes the old-timer nearest the bar, a small thin man with a white beard and hands spotted with age, leaned sideways in his chair and said quietly, "You're staying up at the Danner cabin." It wasn't a question. Cole looked at him. "That's right." Silas Danner's kin, his nephew. The old man nodded slowly, as though this confirmed something he'd suspected. "My name's Edmund Ruiz," he said. "I run the general store. Was a friend of your uncle's some years back." He paused. "Hargrove's man Tidwell came to see me this morning. Asked if anyone new had come through. I told him no." Cole studied him. "Why?" "Because Silas Danner was a decent man who deserved better than what happened to him," Ruiz said simply. "And because Doyle Hargrove is not." The barkeep had gone to the far end of the bar and was occupied with something behind the counter, his back deliberately turned. The other old man at the corner table was staring at his cards with intense concentration. Cole recognized these gestures, the careful distancing of people who wanted to know nothing officially while remaining entirely aware of what was being said. He picked up his coffee cup and moved to Ruiz's table. Over the next hour, in a conversation conducted in quiet voices with frequent pauses whenever the door opened, Edmund Ruiz told Cole what he knew about Doyle Hargrove. It confirmed and expanded what the journal had suggested. Hargrove had arrived in the Coldwater Valley 6 years ago with enough money to buy the largest ranch in the area outright, a spread called the Box H that sat at the mouth of the valley and controlled the only reliable water source for 20 miles in 3 directions. In the years since, he had systematically acquired, through purchase or pressure or other means, Ruiz declined to specify, most of the other land in the valley. Those who sold willingly received fair prices by most accounts. Those who were reluctant found things becoming difficult, Fences cut, cattle disappeared, wells contaminated, a barn burned here and there in the middle of the night. Has anyone brought it to a sheriff? Cole asked. Ruiz gave him a look that contained a lifetime of weary experience. Nearest county seat is 50 miles south. The county sheriff came out twice in the early years, looked around and left each time satisfied that there was nothing requiring his official attention. There are those who say Hargrove's money reaches that far. I wouldn't know about that personally. How many men does he run on the Box H? Regular ranch hands, maybe a dozen, but he keeps another group separate from the ranch work. 6, 8 men, they come and go. They don't do much ranching. Ruiz paused. A man named Tidwell runs that group for him, Clay Tidwell. You'd know him by type if you'd worked around trouble long enough. Cole knew the type. He'd brought in 3 or 4 of that particular type over the years. Men who hired their aptitude for violence to whoever paid best, staying just barely on the manageable side of outright outlaw. Useful tools until they developed ambitions of their own. Does Hargrove know what's in the cabin? Cole asked. Ruiz looked at him directly. He knows something is. He's been trying to get at it for 2 years, ever since Silas's health turned. He made an offer for the property twice while Silas was still alive. Generous offers by all appearances. Silas refused both times. He hesitated. After the second refusal, Silas had a fall. Off his porch, he said. Hit his head on the porch rail. Cole was quiet for a moment. You believe that? I believe Silas Danner was sure-footed as a mountain goat and had been walking that porch for 15 years in all weathers without incident. Ruiz said, beyond that, I wouldn't speculate. Cole looked out the window at the Hargrove Land Company building at the end of the street. Its bright paint cheerful and aggressive in the morning sun. How soon before Hargrove's man reports back to him that someone arrived at the cabin? Tidwell had already been by my store this morning, like I said. If he saw your horse on the trail, and he would have, he watches that trail careful. Hargrove knows already. Cole nodded. He'd assumed as much. He finished his coffee and stood. Much obliged, Mr. Ruiz. I'll say I never spoke to you. I'd appreciate that. Ruiz reached out and touched Cole's arm briefly. Your uncle was a good man who made one bad decision 22 years ago and spent the rest of his life paying for it in various ways. Whatever's up there in that cabin, and I don't know what it is, and I don't want to know. I hope you're careful with it. Hargrove won't stop. He's not the kind that stops. Neither am I, Cole said, and walked out into the morning light. He rode back up the mountain with the awareness of being watched, sitting between his shoulder blades like a persistent ache. He didn't look for the watcher. That would tell the watcher more than it would tell Cole. He rode normally at a moderate pace, Dusty's hooves steady on the pine-shadowed trail, and turned the situation over in his mind from every angle he could find. The core problem was the gold. It was an extraordinary amount of value, sitting in an exposed location that at least one party already had reason to search for. Every hour it remained where it was represented a diminishing advantage. Moving it would require resources he didn't currently have, men, wagons, a destination, the kind of logistical operation that made noise. But leaving it in place meant that any move Hargrove made toward the cabin would find exactly what he was looking for. There was a third option. Cole turned it around carefully, examining it. He could find Doyle Hargrove and talk to him, not negotiate from weakness and not threaten. Both of those would be useless with a man like Hargrove, but information was its own currency. Cole had the journal. Cole had the legal inheritance. Cole had the name of Preston Webb and the documented history of what Webb had done to Calloway and Birch 22 years ago, which, combined with what had happened to Silas on that porch, painted a portrait that certain people in certain positions of authority, federal authority beyond whatever reach Hargrove had locally, would find compelling. What Cole needed was leverage, not physical leverage. He was one man, and matching himself against 8 was a calculation that didn't resolve favorably even at his most optimistic. He needed the kind of leverage that made a powerful man calculate that moving against Cole cost him more than leaving Cole alone. He was still working through the arithmetic of it when he came around the last bend in the trail below the cabin and found 2 men waiting for him on horseback in the middle of the trail. They were hard-looking men, which was to say they looked like men for whom hardness had become the dominant physical characteristic. Everything else worn away by years and weather and the particular erosion of a life spent in service to other men's dirty work. The one on the left was large, red-faced, with a heavy jaw and a posture of practiced aggression. The one on the right was leaner and quieter, with pale eyes that moved and catalogued in a way Cole recognized because it was very similar to the way his own eyes moved. That one was more dangerous. The right-side man wore his iron low, tied down. "You'd be the Danner nephew," the large one said. "I would," Cole said. He kept his hands loose and visible on the saddle horn, Dusty standing still and patient under him. "You boys working for the Hargrove outfit?" "Mr. Hargrove would like a word," the large man said. "Down at the Box H." Cole considered the phrasing. Would like rather than is requesting or any other formulation that acknowledged the possibility of refusal. It was the language of men accustomed to the power of their employer, translating directly into cooperation from everyone they encountered. "That's accommodating of him," Cole said. "Tell him I'll be down to call on him tomorrow morning, 10 o'clock. The large man's expression shifted. "Mr. Hargrove's schedule doesn't—" "Tell him 10 o'clock, Cole said pleasantly. He held the pale-eyed man's gaze for a moment. Man to man, the way dangerous men communicated the essentials without troubling language. Then he neck-reined Dusty off the trail and around the two horses, climbing the last 100 yards to the cabin at his own pace without looking back. He heard them sit there for a moment, then he heard them ride away down the mountain. He breathed out and went inside. That night, Cole made a decision. He went below again with the lantern and opened every crate, making a careful count. 31 crates in total, the ingots varying slightly in size but averaging approximately 8 per crate. He worked it out roughly in his head. At current market rates, what sat below the cabin was worth something in the neighborhood of $240,000. He'd seen a lot of money in his life, in various forms, payouts for bounties, the stakes in high-stakes card games, the reported proceeds of bank robberies he'd been hired to follow up on. He had never seen this kind of money in one place, all in gold, quiet and patient as a mountain. He resealed every crate and went back upstairs. Then he sat at the table with a sheet of paper he'd found in the back room and wrote 2 letters by lantern light. The first was addressed to a federal marshal named Thomas Holt, stationed in Santa Fe, whom Cole had worked alongside twice in the past and trusted as much as he trusted anyone. It detailed the history Silas had recorded in the journal: Preston Webb, Calloway and Birch, the accumulated gold, Doyle Hargrove's identity and activities in the Coldwater Valley. It requested that Holt preserve the letter and act on it if Cole himself was not heard from within 3 weeks. The second letter was addressed to a newspaper editor in Santa Fe named Harrison Gray, whom Cole had never met, but whose paper had a reputation for printing uncomfortable things about powerful people. This letter was shorter and slightly more selective in what it disclosed, but it made the same general shape of the story legible to anyone who read it. He sealed both letters, wrote addresses on the envelopes, and put them in his duster pocket. In the morning, before he rode to the Box H, he would ride first into Arroyo Seco and leave them with Edmund Ruiz for posting. Then he checked his revolver, loaded the chamber he habitually kept empty under the hammer, and went to sleep. The Box H ranch was everything its name implied: large, well-maintained, built to signal permanence and ownership. It sat in the floor of the valley beneath a cottonwood grove, the main house 2 stories of cut stone and timber, with a wide veranda and glass windows that caught the morning light. Outbuildings clustered around it, a large barn, a bunkhouse, a cookhouse, a building Cole identified as a foreman's quarters. Cattle grazed in the flat pasture land beyond the corrals, a healthy herd. Whatever else Doyle Hargrove was, he ran a real operation. Cole had posted his letters with Ruiz at 8 in the morning. Now it was 5 minutes to 10, and he rode through the ranch gate with the unhurried confidence of a man who had been invited. Past 2 hands who watched him from the corral fence without moving, across the packed dirt of the yard to the hitching post before the main house. He dismounted and tied Dusty. The front door of the house opened before he had finished. Doyle Hargrove was perhaps 50 years old, built the way some men are who have spent their lives in the outdoors without doing much physical labor themselves. Large and broad, carrying weight that was substantial without being soft, with the bearing of a man who had spent decades unaccustomed to anyone telling him no. He had iron grey hair, close cut, and dark eyes that were calm and direct, in a way that communicated considerable self-possession. He wore good clothes, not flashy but quality, the kind purchased in Santa Fe or perhaps in Denver, the clothes of a man who had arrived somewhere in life and saw no reason to dress otherwise. Standing slightly behind him and to his right, in the shadow of the doorway, was the pale-eyed man from the trail. "Mr. Danner," Hargrove said, and his voice was pleasant, well-controlled. "Come in." Cole came in. The interior of the house was furnished well, better than anything else Cole had seen in 50 miles of this territory. A sitting room with real carpet, actual paintings on the walls, a fireplace with a carved mantel. Hargrove gestured him to a chair and sat across from him, and the pale-eyed man, Tidwell, Cole now assumed, stationed himself near the door with the professional invisibility of a man practicing at being a piece of furniture. "I understand you've inherited the Danner property," Hargrove said. He had the manner of a man conducting a reasonable business transaction, everything civilized and measured. "I was sorry to hear about your uncle. He was a stubborn man, but there's nothing wrong with stubbornness in the right application." "He spoke of you," Cole said, which was technically true and usefully ambiguous. Something shifted behind Hargrove's eyes very briefly. "Did he? I made him 2 fair offers on that property over the years. He was disinclined. He was attached to the place. Sentiment has its value." Hargrove leaned forward slightly, his elbows on his knees. "I'll make you the same offer I made him, Mr. Danner. $12,000 for the property, the cabin, and everything on it. That's more than fair value, more than double if we're being honest about what mountain land in that condition is worth in this market." Everything on it. Cole let the phrase sit for a moment. "That's a generous offer. I'm a generous man when it suits both parties. What's the interest in that particular piece of land?" Hargrove smiled, and the smile didn't involve his eyes at all. "Consolidation. I've been building a coherent holding in this valley for 6 years. The Danner property is the last piece of the puzzle. It controls the upper approach to the mountain, and I have a vision for developing this valley that requires—" "Mr. Hargrove," Cole said, not impolitely, "I've read my uncle's journal." The room went quiet, not tense, something beyond tense, the particular silence of a situation that has just clarified itself down to its essential terms. Hargrove's expression didn't change, which Cole noted, a man who had worked so hard for so long at controlling his responses that even this produced nothing visible on his face. That was discipline of a significant order. "I see," Hargrove said after a moment. "He was thorough in what he wrote down," Cole said. "Preston Webb, Calloway and Birch. The arrangement you and he never quite made official." He paused. "I've also sent some correspondence this morning to Santa Fe, people who know what to do with the information your uncle provided if they don't hear from me within 3 weeks." Now something moved behind Hargrove's eyes, not anger exactly. Calculation, a man recalibrating, running numbers, assessing costs and outcomes. Cole watched it happen and felt a measured relief. An angry man would have simply acted. A calculating man would take the time to think, and time was Cole's ally. "That was a smart move," Hargrove said finally, and the genuineness of it was faintly startling. "Your father's story isn't yours," Cole said. "What he did to Calloway and Birch, what he may have done to Silas, that's on him. You were a child when most of it happened. But what you've been doing in this valley isn't separated from it as cleanly as you might like, and there are people in Santa Fe who'd be interested in drawing that line." Hargrove looked at him. "What do you want, Mr. Danner?" "The valley," Cole said. "Not the land. I don't want land. The people in it. Ruiz at the general store, the families you've been leaning on. You stop. You leave them alone. Every one of them." He let that settle. "In exchange, the journal stays with me and goes no further. The people in Santa Fe hear that everything has been resolved satisfactorily. You never come near the Danner property again." Hargrove was quiet for a long moment. Tidwell by the door had gone entirely still. And the property itself? Hargrove said. Mine, Cole said, along with whatever's on it. Another long silence. The fireplace ticked. A horse moved in the yard outside. Then Doyle Hargrove sat back in his chair and looked at Cole Danner with an expression that was almost, not quite, but almost, something like respect. You're your uncle's nephew, he said. I am, Cole said. The agreement was not written down. Cole didn't trust written agreements between men like Hargrove. They became documents to be reinterpreted, loopholes to be found, language to be argued over in front of lawyers or judges that Hargrove could afford, and Cole could not. Instead, Cole trusted the calculation he had seen happen behind those dark, controlled eyes. Hargrove was a landman, not an outlaw. His power came from appearing legitimate, from the careful maintenance of respectability over a foundation that would not bear close examination. Cole had given him a clear and specific threat to that respectability with the letters in Santa Fe, and a clear and specific off-ramp. Most men of that type, when the arithmetic resolved clearly enough, took the off-ramp. Cole rode away from the Box H at 11 in the morning with no certainty whatsoever that Hargrove would hold to anything they'd agreed. That uncertainty was manageable. What he had now that he hadn't had the day before was information. Hargrove knew that Cole knew, and Hargrove knew that others knew enough to act if Cole disappeared. That made Cole considerably more expensive to remove than he had been walking in. He spent the next several days at the cabin making it habitable and thinking. He repaired the east side of the roof where the sag was worsening. He rebuilt the corral rails. He cut and split enough wood to last a mountain winter. He thought about the gold. The gold was the problem that didn't resolve as cleanly as the conversation with Hargrove. It couldn't stay where it was indefinitely. Hargrove might hold to their agreement for months, but the temptation of that much wealth, sitting unguarded in a mountain cabin, was the kind of thing that eroded men's better calculations over time. And Cole couldn't simply sell it. Unstamped, unmarked bullion of that quantity moving through normal channels would raise questions that led back to its origin, which led back to dead men and old crimes that would be complicated to explain, even from the position of the man who hadn't committed them. On the fourth evening, Edmund Ruiz rode up the mountain trail and knocked on the cabin door with his hat in his hands. Cole let him in and made coffee. Hargrove's pulled his men off the North Valley fence line, Ruiz said, sitting at the table with the look of a man still surprised by a thing he'd watched happen with his own eyes. The Hendersons, family that runs sheep on the east side of the valley, Hargrove's been leaning on them for 2 years about their water rights. A man came out from the Box H this morning and told them the water dispute was resolved in their favor. He paused. Didn't say why. That's good news, Cole said. What did you do? Ruiz asked. Had a conversation. Ruiz looked at him over the rim of his coffee cup. That's all? It's usually enough, Cole said, when both parties understand what the conversation is actually about. Ruiz was quiet for a moment. Then, your uncle came to me a year before he died, told me a little of what was here. Not the details, just that there was something and that it was complicated, and that he was leaving it to someone who'd know what to do with complicated things. He paused. He trusted you a great deal. I know, Cole said. I wish he'd said so while he was alive to say it. He wasn't built for saying things directly. Ruiz smiled, a small, weathered expression. Neither are most men I've known. After Ruiz left, Cole sat on the porch in the cooling evening air and looked out at the mountains going purple and dark, against a sky, the color of old copper. The pines stood still in the windless dusk. Somewhere down the slope, a night bird called and fell silent. He thought about what Silas had done with the years after. The long, deliberate decision to do nothing with the gold, to simply live on the mountain with it sitting below his feet, keeping watch over it the way some men keep watch over sins they can't undo. There was something in that choice that Cole hadn't expected to find himself understanding. The gold had come from a mountain, through work and luck, and the particular suffering of men who hadn't survived to see it paid out. Moving it into the ordinary world of commerce and expenditure required a transaction that didn't account for any of that history. He'd had 3 weeks to think about what to do with it. He spent those 3 weeks doing several things simultaneously. He rode the valley, slowly, introducing himself to the families Hargrove had been pressing, the Hendersons with their sheep, a Mexican family named Vega, who ran a small cattle operation in the south pasture, an elderly woman named Clara Whitmore, who owned a quarter section of Prime Valley land and had been offered repeatedly inadequate compensation for it. He said little at each stop, listened a great deal, drank whatever was offered, and left behind the general impression of a man who was present and not about to leave. He also corresponded with Thomas Holt in Santa Fe. The federal marshal was a methodical, unhurried man who understood that the value of certain information lay in its careful handling. He wrote back twice, asking specific questions about dates and names that Cole answered as fully as the journal allowed. No formal investigation was announced. No one rode up the mountain with a badge. But things began to happen at the county level that Holt had apparently made happen. Quiet inquiries, a review of certain land transactions, a renewed interest in the circumstances of several accidents in the valley over the past several years. Hargrove held to the agreement. Cole watched for the signs of strain, a move against Ruiz, an unexplained incident involving one of the valley families, the reappearance of Tidwell on the mountain trail. None came. What came instead was a gradual, almost imperceptible change in the quality of the valley's silence. The particular shift from the fear-laden quiet of a place pressed under weight to the ordinary quiet of a place simply going about its business. On the 18th day, Cole made his decision about the gold. He rode to Santa Fe. It took 2 days to find the right man, a quiet, careful assayer named Williams, who had worked for the Federal Land Office for 15 years and had a reputation for discretion that had been tested repeatedly and had held. Cole sat with him for 3 hours in his back office and told him the full story, with the journal as documentation. Williams listened without interrupting, made notes in a small book, asked 4 specific clarifying questions, and sat in silence for several minutes at the end. "The gold from Callaway and Birch's share," he said finally. "That would be considered unclaimed estate." "That's what I reckoned," Cole said. "There would be a process, a federal process, long, likely, complicated." Williams looked at him steadily. "And your uncle's share?" The third he held back from Webb. "That," Cole said, "is what I'd like to discuss." They discussed it for another hour. The outcome, roughly, the 2/3 of the original gold that could be attributed to the Webb share and the deceased partner's shares would enter the federal process, which would determine its disposition through channels Cole had no interest in controlling. The remaining third, Silas's legitimate share, documented by the journal and the original extraction history, was legally Cole's inheritance. It was, even at a conservative estimate, a substantial amount of money, enough to do something real with if a man had a mind to. Cole rode back up the mountain with the weight of that knowledge settling into him like ballast, making him feel steadier and somewhat more grounded than he was accustomed to feeling. He sat on the porch in the evening and thought about Silas, who had lived for 15 years with a fortune below his feet and a rented room in Laredo and a single window facing an alley, and had apparently been comfortable with that. Cole was not built for that kind of patience with accumulated wealth, but he was also not built for the other extreme, for the sudden, conspicuous spending that turned heads and invited trouble. He thought about what Silas might have done, and then he thought about what Cole Danner actually wanted to do, and he found, somewhat to his own surprise, that those two things overlapped considerably. He stayed at the cabin through the fall and into the early winter, which came early and hard in the high country, laying down 2 feet of snow by mid-November and closing the upper trail for weeks at a time. He was not a man accustomed to staying in one place, and there were restless periods, evenings when the walls of the cabin felt very close, and he sat on the porch in the cold, simply to have open sky above him. But there was also something else, something he hadn't anticipated, which was the gradual accumulation of the place into him, the way the particular bend of light came through the east window on clear mornings, the sound the pines made in the wind that came down from the high ridges on winter nights, the exact quality of the mountain silence, which was not the silence of absence, but of fullness. Of the world going on in all its million small activities, without requiring any observation or input from Cole Danner. Edmund Ruiz rode up once a month when the trail was passable, bringing supplies and news from the valley. In November, he reported that the county had opened a formal review of 3 land transactions from the previous 2 years, one of which involved property purchased from the Vega family under what the reviewing authority had concluded were materially misleading representations. The Vega family had been offered remediation. In December, Ruiz reported that Tidwell had left the territory, quit the Box H, packed his things, and ridden east without particular ceremony. In January, he reported that Doyle Hargrove himself had ridden to Santa Fe and had been seen entering the Federal Land Office building with a lawyer. Cole listened to each report and said little. The machinery he'd set in motion was operating without his hand on it, which was the best possible outcome. His job now was to avoid interfering with it. In February, when the snow had eased enough to make travel sensible, he rode down into Arroyo Seco and called on the valley families one at a time. He had done his arithmetic: the cabin repairs, the coming spring supplies, a horse for the corral, all of that accounted for. And then the remainder of what was coming to him from Williams' federal process, which would take time, but was moving forward. There was enough to do something useful. He made a proposal to the valley families collectively, a water cooperative that would give every holding equal access to the valley's primary water source, formalized and registered, so that no single owner, including Cole, could ever unilaterally restrict access to the others. The Hendersons and the Vegas and Clara Whitmore and 3 other families who had been living for years under the anxiety of Hargrove's water leverage listened to him explain it, and then they asked their questions, and then they voted, and the vote was unanimous. Cole filed the cooperative paperwork in the county seat on a Thursday in March, riding the 50 miles south with Ruiz as witness. He came back up the mountain in the late afternoon of a clear spring day, the snow retreating from the lower slopes and the pines, releasing their particular sharp sweetness into the warming air. He unsaddled Dusty and turned him into the corral, now fully repaired with new rails. He went up to the porch and sat down and looked at the valley below, which was greening in the lower reaches where the snowmelt reached first. The mountains were enormous and calm around him on every side, doing what mountains had always done and would always do regardless of what men arranged among themselves in the valleys at their feet. He thought about what his uncle had written. Cole would know what to do. Cole always knew what to do when things got complicated. He wasn't sure Silas had been right about that. Cole had made his share of mistakes in 34 years, had followed wrong roads and misread people, and trusted calculations that didn't hold. But he had done the best available version of right by the valley and by Silas's memory, and the gold was going where it needed to go, and the people who had been pressed down for years were standing up straighter, and the man responsible for pressing them was now working out his own complicated arrangements with federal authorities in Santa Fe. That was enough. That was, Cole thought, considerably more than enough. He did not sell the cabin. That surprised him when he took account of himself that spring. He had expected to feel the pull of the trail again, the familiar restlessness that had kept him moving for 11 years, the discomfort of any arrangement that resembled permanence. It came some days. He felt it like weather, moving through and then moving on, but it no longer arrived with the same insistence that had once made it impossible to ignore. He took 2 more bounty jobs that spring, both of them in the territory. Men wanted for specific crimes with specific prices on their heads. He rode out, found them, brought them in, collected the money, and rode back up the mountain. It felt different now, not the job itself, which was the same as it had always been, but the coming back. Having a place to come back to changed the shape of the going. In April, a letter arrived from Thomas Holt in Santa Fe, informing him that the federal review of the Hargrove land transactions had resulted in 3 findings of fraud, that Doyle Hargrove had agreed to a substantial financial settlement and a permanent injunction against future land acquisition in the territory, and that the matter of the Preston Webb gold cache was being handled as a special estate matter, the final disposition of which would take approximately another year to resolve, but which was proceeding in a manner consistent with the claims Cole had advanced. Holt added, at the end, "Your uncle's journal was the most useful piece of documentation I have received in 11 years of federal service. He was a careful man." Cole folded the letter and put it in the journal, which he had placed on the shelf between the window and the fireplace, where the morning light fell on its worn brown cover every clear day. He went outside to split wood, because the pile was getting low and it was still cold at night, and because there was something satisfying about useful work with a clear object and a clear result. The log placed, the maul lifted, the clean split, the two halves added to the stack. Silas had known that. He had probably split 10,000 cords of wood in his life, Cole estimated. Each swing of the maul, a small act of order imposed on the raw material of the world. The mountains stood around him, permanent and patient. Dusty moved in the corral below the cabin, with his characteristic unhurried dignity. The pines held the morning light. Cole worked through the afternoon and let the mountain do what mountains do. Stay still, stay present, endure. And for the first time in a life spent moving, he found that he was content, genuinely, unexpectedly content, to be in one place while the world went on. Thank you for riding along with Cole Danner and the mountain that changed everything. If this story stayed with you, do us the kindness of subscribing to the channel. There's always another tale waiting just past the next ridge. Late that evening, in the last of the light, he sat on the porch steps and watched the valley below go purple and dark as the sun dropped behind the western peaks. The cabin stood solid at his back, its logs silver grey in the dusk, the chimney putting up a steady thread of smoke into the cooling air. The trapdoor below would hold what it held for a little while longer. The federal process was patient, and Cole had learned to be patient too, in the way that mountains are patient, not by expecting nothing, but by understanding that everything that matters takes the time it takes and arrives when it arrives. He was 34 years old. He had a cabin. He had a valley that was breathing easier than it had in years. He had a horse and a revolver and a journal full of a dead man's careful writing, and the knowledge that Silas Danner had been proud of him, which he found, now that he could hold it at some distance and examine it clearly, to be worth more than he would have expected. Somewhere below in the valley, a light came on in what he knew to be the Vega homestead. A warm, small point of yellow in the gathering dark. Then another from the direction of the Henderson place. The mountain held them all, patient and enormous, the way it had always held everything in this country, the living and the dead, the gold and the secrets, the old wrongs and the small incremental adjustments that passed for justice in a world that rarely delivered anything cleaner. Cole Danner sat on the porch of his inherited cabin and watched the lights come on in the valley below, and felt the ground solid beneath his boots, and understood finally what his uncle had understood all those years, that what a man keeps and what he gives away are both ways of saying the same thing about who he is, and that sometimes the most powerful move available to a man is simply to stay. The mountain held the night around him quiet and immense. He was home,